Chapter 20, The Next Targets. Almost before I knew it, it was June of 1944. The Marianas Islands were the next targets in our island-hopping campaign that had begun in Guadalcanal. The official name for the Marianas campaign was Operation Forager. Our new objectives were Saipan, Tinian, Guam, and Peleliu. They were to be the next stepping stones toward our final destination, Japan itself. Operation Forager was under the command of Admiral Nimitz, and Marine General Holland Smith was in charge of the amphibious landings. Howling Mad Smith was what everyone called him. I met Major General Smith several times during the war. Though he seemed like a mild-mannered man, more like a middle-aged storekeeper than a Marine, I also saw what he looked like when he was angry. His face became red as a fire, and he seemed to grow twice as tall. We were divided into two task forces. The Northern Task Force was made up of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions. The Southern Task Force was made up of the 3rd Marine Division and the 1st Army Brigade. I was in that 3rd Marine Division and found myself reunited with several of my former Signal Corps buddies, including Smitty and George Boy, who once again tried to crack my ribs with one of his southern bear hugs. "Chief," he drawled, "I am so all-fired glad to see you." Smitty pulled back the sleeve of his shirt and held his brown arm next to mine. "Looky here," he said. "While our boy Ned has been up in shady Honolulu, we've been down here in the sunny South Pacific working on our tans." Soon the talk turned to where we were headed. Would it be Saipan or Guam? We didn't have long to wait. Our orders came down the next day. The Northern Task Force would be taking Tinian and Saipan. Our objective was Guam. All these years later, I'm still thankful that I was not sent to Saipan. The other code talkers who landed there all came back alive, but they still do not know how they survived. Their D-Day was June 15, 1944. There was much resistance against our first waves that came ashore, and the sea was rough. Boats were tipping over before they even came close to the beach. Jess Smith, Wilfred Billy, Danny Aki, Frank Thompson, and Carl Gorman. They were some of the code talkers who landed on Saipan. They said it was the worst place they'd ever been. Of course, none of us had yet seen Iwo Jima. Shells were hitting the water all around us, Jesse Smith told me later. Some people had to cut off their packs to keep from drowning and then struggle into shore without guns or equipment. But when things got a little quieter, Wilfred Billy said, those of us who lost our stuff were able to go back down to the beach and get packs and guns from the men who got killed and were washed up on shore. There was more than enough. Saipan was 14 miles long and 5 miles wide. Before war came to it, it must have been a beautiful place with its palm trees and sugar plantations. It was the first island the U.S. Marines invaded when there were still a population of Japanese civilians, including many women and children. Having those women and children to defend probably made the Japanese soldiers resist even harder. They fought on the beaches and from caves where their soldiers were dug in. Just as had been the case so many times before, our naval bombardment and air assaults hadn't been very effective in knocking out the coastal defenses. Hundreds of Marines died in the water and on the beaches. As our Marines moved farther inland, the Japanese kept sending wave after wave of banzai attacks against them. But Howling Mad Smith refused to order his Marines to retreat. This is one of the messages that Wilfred Billy sent for General Smith. To all units, be on the alert for banzai attacks. Dig in and report positions. The enemy screamed and threw hand grenades and emptied their weapons as they ran forward. There were thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians both in those attacks. Some were armed with nothing more than sharpened sticks. They believed their only choice was to die for their empire. It's hard to describe how loud and frightening and terrible such attacks are. But all those banzai attacks failed. From dug-in positions, the Marines stopped them with machine gun fire. The enemies fell like tall grass cut by a scythe. The saddest part of Saipan, Wilfred told me, was those Japanese civilians. The Japanese women and children ran from the Marines in terror. They'd been told that Americans were devils who would kill and torture them. The Japanese government propaganda frightened those poor people so much that they didn't allow themselves to be captured. They blew themselves up with grenades. They climbed to the tops of cliffs and threw their children off before hurling themselves onto the rocks below. Hundreds jumped from the cliffs near Marpy Point or waded into the ocean and drowned before our shocked Marines could reach them. There were tears in Wilfred's eyes as he remembered it. On Saipan, over 3,000 Americans died between June 15th and July 13th, when the Marines were pulled back. The entire Japanese garrison on Saipan of 20,000 men was wiped out. No one knows how many civilians took their own lives. There was no way, Wilfred said, to celebrate after that victory. Rough as it was, there were still some things we Navajos found to smile about. Danny Aki always seemed to have a funny story to tell, even about D-Day on Saipan. He and Sam Holliday, another of us code talkers, had just finished digging in. Shrapnel was raining down all around them. The ground was shaking from explosions, and they were ducking down. All of a sudden, something heavy went splat right onto Danny's helmet. I've been hit, Danny yelled. Then he noticed Sam was looking at his helmet and laughing. What Donnie thought it was shrapnel was actually a big frog that had jumped into their hole and landed on his helmet. Then there were the chickens. During the landing, Danny had noticed them flying around. That was one of the ways I found out how life is different for an Indian and a white man, Danny said. Those chickens, those sea rations, they were not very good. We might go 2-3 weeks without a hot meal. But after a while, we see those chickens that belong to the natives on that island there. So I say to Samuel, you make a slingshot. Samuel, he was a good shot, and he killed one right away. Those white men, they did not know how to make a chicken stew, but we found a big can and boiled water and cut up that chicken and put it in. Of course, everybody's watching us. What are you doing, Chief? They ask us. Well, we're going to make chicken stew, and we did, We cook it, and everyone wants a taste of warm soup there. Even the colonel, he said, grab me one, Samuel. Everybody was boiling chicken soup right around there all day. Chapter 21, Guam. While the Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions were taking Saipan, our 3rd Marine Division boarded our own ships and set sail, ready to hit the beaches. The landing on Guam was set for June 18th, but it did not happen. At the last minute, Admiral Spruance decided to send the 27th Army Division, soldiers who were supposed to be our backups, to help take Saipan. The 3rd Division was ordered to hold their position. The unit I was in was sent back to the little islands of Kwajalein and Eniwetok to the east of Guam. It was hard being told just to wait on those little islands without knowing what was going to happen, or when. There ain't nothing here to do but count legs, Georgia Boy said as we sat in our barracks watching the land crabs scuttling up and down the coconut trees. Those big crabs made me nervous about going out at night. They looked like gigantic spiders and were as common on Eniwetok as ground squirrels are back home. If I ever stepped on one in my bare feet, I was sure it would chop my toes off with those big pincers. I was teased about being more scared of crabs than enemy soldiers, but no amount of teasing could get me to set foot out of the barracks after dark, when every place outside was crawling with crabs, and you can hear them rustling and clicking through the palm leaves. All there was to do on the islands was drill and swim, play cards, and eat fish, complain, and sleep. But we were better off board on shore than stuck on board like the other Marine units. They were kept cooped up on the hot, crowded transport ships out at sea, stuck there for almost 2 months, just waiting. Another strange thing about war grandchildren is that when better things do not go as planned, they may turn out better. So it was in our invasion of Guam. Our landing was delayed, but not the Navy bombardment. Instead of only 1 day, they now had almost 2 weeks to work over the coast of Guam. They were led by Admiral Connolly. Everyone knew him as Close-Up Connolly, and he really lived up to that nickname. Admiral Connolly had learned from the mistakes at Bougainville and Tarawa, where the naval shelling had been too brief or too inaccurate to break down Japanese defenses. Close-Up Connolly brought his 3 cruiser divisions and 6 battleships in right next to the shore to pound the coastal defenses. For 13 days, the battleships boomed and heavy shells rained down on target. By the time Admiral Connolly was done, the Japanese beach defenses were pulverized. Airstrikes had also wiped out all of the Japanese planes on Guam that might have attacked our invaded forces. Finally, we were loaded back on ship and off the shores of Guam. It meant a lot for us to take Guam. Guam was U.S. territory. Before the Japanese attacked, it had been an American island. I read some about it in my geography book in Navajo High School and was reading even more about it now. That was one thing that I did before every invasion. I'd scrape up whatever reading material there was on board ship about the place we were going. Gay here is our travel agent, our lieutenant wisecracked. He's checking out all the best hotels for us to stay in. Even though they kidded me, the other guys asked me what I'd learned about Guam, and I told them. Its people had been American citizens since the Spanish-American War. They were called Camaros, a U.S. naval base, a deep water harbor, and a Marine airfield had all been taken over by the Japanese when they invaded Guam on December 8, 1941, the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Chamorros had stayed loyal to us after the Japanese came, and they tried to resist. As a result, the Japanese had been very cruel to them. As the Chamorros refused to work for the Japanese, they were shot or put into concentration camps on the island. You know, grandchildren, for a long time, even after the war, it was hard for me to have any good thoughts about the Japanese. What troubled me the most was the way they treated the native people of the islands they conquered. They believed only Japanese were real humans. Anyone else could be treated like a dog. Never forget, grandchildren, that we must always see all other people as human beings, worthy of respect. We must never forget, as the Japanese forgot, that all life is holy. Tumon Bay, Major General Turnage, said to his officers as he stood on the bridge. With a wave of his hand, he indicated the wide 2.5-mile sweep of beach that was now in view. Although I was assigned to a landing party, I was up there on the bridge checking signals with the other members of our code team who'd been staying on board to send and receive messages. Because of our special road, we code talkers were often able to go places where ordinary Marines hardly ever set foot. Best landing place on the island, Major General Turnage said, nodding his head. No reef to cross, nice level sand, darn fine landing place. Just where the enemy expects us. Then he smiled. Sorry to disappoint them. Instead of Tumon Bay, we went further south. There we would have to cross the reef to land on 2 western beaches that lay below sheer bluffs. July 21st was set for the invasion, W Day, as our leaders named it. As the first light outlined the island, I stood by the rail watching. I'd managed to find a wooden box to stand on, so I wasn't just looking at the backs of other Marines as sometimes happened. Hey, little fella, want me to boost you up on my shoulders? A familiar voice said from behind me. It was Smitty, of course. He sometimes kidded me about being so short, but I always had an easy answer. Bigger guys make bigger targets. The next thing I knew, I was on an alligator rumbling over the reef. I could hear the roar of the LVT's engines, the whop, 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 small waves hitting the metal side of the boat, and the coral being crushed by the treads. Sort of like the sound sugar cubes make when they are crushed between teeth. But I don't remember hearing the whistle and the order to land the landing party. Once again, I had that familiar, unsettling feeling of being in a movie where the film has been broken and then spliced together a whole scene later. All of a sudden, sand was churning under my feet as I sprinted across the beach. It was easier for me to run now because all of us code talkers had the new, lighter, portable radio units. But it was not just because a new unit on my back was lighter that I had run so much faster. I no longer had 40 pounds of TBX radio to hide behind, and I needed to get cover as fast as I could. Our first wave of alligators had crawled up onto Red Beach just below Asia Point. The beach was small, only 200 yards long, but the bluffs made up for it. They looked like they were 10 miles high. You got any hills like that back home, Chief? Smitty yelled. We had taken shelter in a shell crater from the American bombardment. We'd been met with small arms and machine gun fire, but no enemy bombs or shells were falling among us. I peered up toward the bluff, where he was pointing with his chin. In the time we'd been together, he learned the Navajo way of pointing with your lips or your chin rather than your hands. That hill rose up steeper than I would have liked. Not really 10 miles, but at least 200 feet. We had to climb it, even though the Japanese were firing down at us from the heights. I looked back toward the shore where a tank was being unloaded. As long as we don't have to carry one of those, I think we can do it, I said. Then we went running across the beach, dodging back and forth so that we would not be a good target for the small arms fire coming from above. All the way up that cliff, bullets kept spraying the sand in our faces and bouncing off the rocks around us. Somehow, neither one of us got hit. But when we got to the top, the fire was so intense that all we could do was dig in along the rest of the men in our first wave. I got out my radio and began sending. We were going to have to fight for every inch of ground. It's not easy for us to break out from our beachhead. There were over 18,000 Japanese troops on Guam. They'd mostly been deployed at Tumon Bay, but when their commanders finally realized we weren't going near there, they moved them to head us off and keep us boxed in. We code talkers were kept busy, sending message after message from the shore to the command ship. Our headquarters had been set up now on shore, and I was told not just to report to the command post, but to set myself up a cot there. housed in the same tent as General Howling Mad Smith. Before long, Admiral Nimitz and his generals were meeting in that tent to discuss battle plans while we Navajo dockers waited in the corner, right there next to the top brass. I was only in that tent for a little while, but it made me feel extra safe being guarded right along with the general.